So I think we left off here, looking at the idea of how to work with the soil and manage it and improve it, hopefully. And so I finally found the word allelopathic. I was looking for that right at the end of last lecture. I knew I had seen it somewhere, but I highlighted it now. So that's something that you definitely have to consider when you're looking at cover crops and green manures, is making sure that it doesn't produce any chemicals that the intended crop that could go in there would get negatively impacted by. So you need to know a little bit about your cover crops as well as the actual crop that you plan to grow and harvest. So, but if you do it correctly, it can be very, very helpful. Not only with, when you pick different depths of rooting, that's actually a really good thing. Having some diversity in root systems really can help with soil texture and water infiltration. And then you have improvement of organic matter over time, just because of the plants growing and dying in that area. And then certainly when you have a cover crop, you don't have exposed soil that would be lending itself to erosion. And so you can do cover crops. You can also just add in organic matter into the soil, manure and things like that. The whole green manure I explained last time is just if you decide to till in the cover crop, then they would start referring to it as a green manure. And so this is just to get you to think about some different cover crops that are routinely used in agricultural systems across the United States. And again, it does depend on your geographic region, what would make sense, as well as the crop you're going to grow. But you can see that there's some advantages and disadvantages. Nothing's perfect. I took issue with the very top statement here. It says clovers fix nitrogen. Is that really accurate? It's like, really? He's an extension scientist. He should know better. So that's not quite accurate, because remember, plants don't fix nitrogen, right? It's their symbiotic bacterial partner. So he did that a couple times in the list here, I noticed. So just, and that's very common. I see that mistake made a lot, even by scientists, PhD scientists. So be careful about that. And I would hope that you educate people if they start talking about, oh yeah, these plants are legumes, they can fix nitrogen. No, not the plants themselves can't do that. Okay, so that's kind of one of my pet peeves that they gloss over and kind of oversee. Okay, so you can see even peas, beans, and soybeans make the list. So these can be looked at as cover crops, even though they are an important commercial crop as well. But they're certainly good in terms of they add in a nice dose of nitrogen as they're growing. And then if you choose to till them in, that's another dose of nitrogen when the rhizobia, the nodules break open, all that nitrogen as well. So, but what if you don't want to till? And so this is a new thing, a fairly new thing, a big push. And I'm actually kind of happily surprised that it has been rather embraced in the agricultural world. I thought it would meet a lot more resistance than it did. So this no-till idea, basically you go ahead and you might have a cover crop, for example, and the cover crop just dies, and then you just go ahead with very minimal work on the surface of the soil. You go ahead and plant your next seeds for your crop. And so you're not churning the soil over in any significant manner. You might need to do like a chisel plow, which is really shallow, and it's just kind of creating a very shallow trench, so to speak. And that's not so bad. It's better than if you've looked at in the chapter, they show some machinery that can really do a lot of deep tilling. And that's starting to get phased out in a lot of different crop systems. And so you just leave the cover crop or the previous year's crop, the above ground part that did not get harvested, you just leave it there. And the idea is that if you just leave the above ground material there, whether, cover crop or whatever, it certainly is helping prevent erosion, and it is doing, the soil structures improved, organic matter, water infiltration, all of that. And then from a microbiological perspective, a huge benefit is that it does not disrupt mycorrhizal networks. And so if you were to deeply till your land, all the mycorrhizal hyphae, all the mycelium would get disrupted. And they find that if you can leave that largely intact, that the crops that get planted in do better than if you go in there and just massively till everything up and churn everything up. And so I think that is a huge benefit that sometimes doesn't get really put onto the list when you talk to non-microbiologists. They kind of forget about that idea, but it's a big deal. And so that is definitely one of the many advantages. So no-till, of course, is less labor, less cost as well. And so there's a lot of payoffs to it. So it's gaining in popularity. And I think now that they're seeing that it can work, the skepticism is kind of falling away and people are realizing that it can work. Yes.
Have you seen any kind of solar connection?
Yes, that is a problem. And that's probably the number one thing they point to. They go, oh, what about, my soil's getting compacted? And that is definitely, I think it kind of depends on what machinery you use to do before you plant your seeds. Like, are you using a standard chisel plow, or are you going in and doing things more manually, And so that is a problem. That is a concern. And there's really, you got to think about it and work with it for your particular field. But no-till is popping up a lot more. One other thing to think about when you look at what's happening in the soil, there's a lot of carbon and there's a lot of nitrogen. So they often talk about this ratio, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that you need to pay attention to that. And that's definitely true, because this ratio really does impact quite a bit of different things going on, including organic matter decomposition. So when you have the soil microbes hanging out, of course, in order for them to stay alive, they have to eat, so to speak, carbon and nitrogen, because they're organic organisms like we are, and so they need that supply. And so you need to make sure that you have a decent ratio of carbon and nitrogen that microbes, it's in the realm of what microbes need. They figured out that microbes in the soil need like a 24-to-1 ratio, 24 units of carbon to 1 unit of nitrogen. So I would like you to know that ratio. Okay, it's kind of an important concept. And so this is, the thinking is, if you can get cover crops and green manures that are close to that ratio, then the microbes will be happy because they'll get their food and their nutrient needs met, their energy needs met, but they won't get out of balance. They won't explode in population or crash in population. And so if you end up with cover crops that have a really high carbon compared to nitrogen, then what tends to happen is the microbes go crazy. They're like, wow, I got all this carbon. I am just going to eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. And then their population levels explode. Well, one of the downsides, like the domino impact of that, is that now all these many more microbes that are occurring in the soil, they need nitrogen for their own metabolism growth. And so they start to scarf up the nitrogen that should have gone to the plant. All right, so if you get this imbalance of microbes because they're getting too much carbon too quickly, then they start to kind of hog the nitrogen and for themselves, and the plants don't get as much as they should. And so you have to have, that's kind of the classic example of why you should kind of target that 24:1 ratio rather than going really high with your carbon. So again, knowing growing plants in a typical soil system, you definitely have to understand a little bit of microbiology in order to really do this correctly and keep a healthy soil system. And so they basically say you need a balance. If you look at this list here, there's, starting up top, you can see rye straw, 82:1. That's pretty big. And so again, too much of anything could be bad for you, including too much carbon. You can see the 24:1 is further down on the list. You want to get closer to that, so that mature alfalfa hay is almost perfect for that 24:1 balance. Rotted manure is pretty decent as well. And so thinking about these ideas, you need to be careful of what you're providing to the soil as a cover crop, for example. And so you definitely want microbes there. You want diversity of the microbes there. You just don't want these huge populations that can really cause some problems. If you go the other direction, too low of populations, if you starve the microbes, then the plants start to suffer in that regard too, because they need those microbes there to help recycle nutrients, release minerals from the soil, get those minerals into the water for the plants. And so again, you need this balance of the microbial populations of diversity. And cover crops can really influence that. And green manures can really influence that. So you have to know what you're doing and pay attention to that. Yeah. Okay, what's going on here? It's not advancing. All right, there, finally, after 10 clicks. All right, so here, I really like this image because it's showing the idea of when you are trying to grow plants, there's two different camps, so to speak, with the inorganic fertilizers off to the right, where you just supply those minerals to the soil, and that really does just get immediately taken up by the plant. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Obviously it's a good thing in the sense that the plant can readily use it and take it up right away. And so that's a definite benefit from the inorganics. However, on the left, you see this idea of organic fertilizers where they're more complex molecules. They could be manure or cover crops or green manures. And so you're supplying that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and then that will stimulate the microbes. That's the food for them. And so then you'll get the microorganisms growing nicely and doing their bit in the soil to help the plant. So the microorganisms are doing more than just releasing, they're recycling all the organic matter, of course, breaking it down, recycling it so the plant can get access to some of it, the minerals, they're allowing for all of that. But microorganisms doing way more than just that for the plant. Yes, it's helping the plant for the plant's nutrition, but it's helping protect the plant. It's communicating with the plant. There's a lot of benefits to having the right types and diversity of microbes with the plants. And so two kind of different ways of approaching how to grow plants. And one of the other things to think about with inorganic fertilizers, especially at the levels that have been historically put into soil systems in agricultural fields. I'm not really talking so much necessarily about backyard gardens, but agricultural systems, they tend to, or at least historically, they would over fertilize. And then you get too many of those minerals, they're salts essentially, so now you get salty soil, saline soil. They've actually found that inorganic fertilizers can crash microbe populations of the soil. If there's too much of that, microbes suffer for it. It's actually very kind of toxic to the microbes. And so that's another thing. If you don't know what you're doing in terms of the synthetic fertilizers, you could really negatively impact the microbial populations and diversity. And so there's things you need to think about on both ends of the spectrum. You know, with organic, it's going to take longer because you have to break down all that organic matter. And so the plant has to wait, so to speak, for the microbes to do their job before they get access to it. And so that, you know, you could consider that a downside. On the other hand, it's more of a steady state release of nutrients. And so that steady state, longer release will feed the plants longer. Certainly less likelihood of those breakdown products going into the water table, including rivers and streams, like the inorganics can do. And so, you know, there's pros and cons to both. But I also like this image or this phrase saying, we don't grow plants, we grow the soil. The soil grows the plants. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about how to grow plants in a soil system. You really focus on how do we grow the soil. And in particular, they're thinking about the microbes in the soil. That's what they're really pointing to. They're saying if you have that rich soil, good mixtures of microbes, good diversity, that goes a long way toward creating healthy plants in that soil system. So I think it's something that is gaining in popularity, mainly because they're forced to think this way now, in the sense that so many of the chemicals that have been applied into soil systems are starting to get phased out. So, and customer, what is that? You know, you pay with your dollar, so to speak, you vote with your dollar type thing. If people are buying more organic, and that's telling the growers something, and they need to adjust to better target their customers. And so there is that kind of influence too by how you choose to purchase food. Okay, I think that's the last, or no, let's get into fertility. A couple more things to say. So this idea of, you know, how to create a fertile soil. Certainly you can go and purchase fertilizer, and the typical thing here is they provide it usually nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It's always in that order on the bag when you see the ratios there. That 18:24:6 is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, always in that order. And so that's very typical when you go to a gardening supply store. They will have that kind of fertilizer. You can buy it that way. You can get that also just through cover crops, green manures. There's lots of different options on how you get these nutrients into the soil system. And really, typically when they say synthetic fertilizer, they're referring to inorganic. Okay, and then the organic is more like manures and cover crops and things like that. So every time you grow a crop and then harvest it out of that soil, of course, you're going to be taking nutrients from the soil that then need to get replaced. And so you can't just keep growing plants in that soil year after year and not replenish. You have to do that. And so, I mean, that's a pretty standard idea here. And so one way or another, you need to be monitoring how fertile your soil is and adjust appropriately. Certainly the ease of adjusting is commercial fertilizers win on that, because it's very easy to do synthetic fertilization. But having said that, there is a big push, at least, well, in Europe too, and here in the United States, for more of a shift to manures and cover crops and green. Organic, having organic farms is pretty tricky. There's a lot of, to be certified organic, you have to go through a lot to get that. And it's expensive, and it's not always, it doesn't always make sense for in order to make a good profit, especially with some of these smaller farms. One of my former grad students, Andrew, he took over his family farm from his parents and turned it into a permaculture teaching farm in northern Wisconsin. And they grow pretty much organically, but they can't certify that way because there's a few things they're not doing that they need to meet to be certified organic. But I would buy food for them in a heartbeat because I know their practices align with what I like in food, which is whether they have their animals that they're raising, they take incredible care of all their animals, and as well as using organic material for all the crops that they're using. And so I don't necessarily always purchase certified organic, even though I like that idea, but I know that can be very tricky. And so getting to know your farmers, if you go to the farmers market around here, you can quickly find out how they grow their crops and their animals, and choose appropriately for what you believe in and what you want to have. So application method, if you want to go into that, you can certainly, depends on what fertilizer, but like for ammonia, that's a gas. So you have to inject it into the soil in gas forms. You can buy solids and apply to the field and soil in that way. You can also do liquids. And so sometimes that's even with organics, like manure, they slurry that up and then I will apply it through a hose system. And you can, chelate, you can chelate you can add chelators in, so that will make it easier for the plants to get access to it. And then this is a new buzzword within growing crops, fertigation. That is a new thing, relatively new thing. And it's this idea of adding fertilizer right into the irrigation water. And it's commonly talked about in like indoor growing. I hear this term a lot from the people who are in the indoor ag businesses, where they will talk about fertigation. And so that is a real successful way. And now with the computer technology that they can have the right sensors in the water to look at what minerals are missing, what ones are too abundant, and they can adjust appropriately. So it's getting really kind of slick how well they can manage the fertilization through this fertigation process. So it's gotten a whole lot easier than it used to be. All right. I keep clicking and nothing's happening. All right, finally. Okay. I just want to also point out the green manure idea. One of my former grad students, Ben, he did a study looking at green manures locally here. He worked with the Seeds and Spore farm here in the area, and they were gracious enough to allow him some acreage in their potato field plots because they were having a problem with potato scab disease. And when Ben was chatting with the owners of the farm, they're like, well, why don't you use some of our acreage? Because we were trying to, decrease potato scab disease. So they were like, yeah, come use our farm and do your study. So it worked out really well. So you're seeing some scabby potatoes there that no one would purchase and eat. And so we were trying to decrease that from happening. And so Ben, it was really interesting because he came and did his undergrad here, started working on his master's, then decided to get his bachelor's of science in nursing. So he had his BSN degree. Then he came back and finished his master's. Then he went to DO school. And so very interesting path. So his interest is in human health, but he was interested in doing this kind of study because he could see the parallels between plant health and human health and the use of microbes in both systems. And so he liked the idea of using medicinal plants that have been long known to be effective in human health. And so he was asking the question, can we use medicinal plants to help the potato plant defend itself against this bacterial pathogen? And so he worked with a couple of different medicinal plants, calendula and comfrey. And he found that so what he did was he would grow up these plants and then chop the above ground material, chop it up like you would do, kind of simulating what growers would do with their equipment. And then once the rows were made in the field, he would just kind of sprinkle the above ground material into the row in a single layer, and then he put his potatoes down on top of that and then covered the rows. Row. Really simple. And yet that had a pretty heavy impact on decreasing scab disease. And so this idea that these were cover crops, green manures, that were releasing chemicals that somehow we hypothesized they were feeding the good bacteria in the soil as well as the plant and allowing for the plant to resist disease. And so there was quite a reduction. Yeah, 24%. That's pretty significant. Use of comfrey, 24% reduction. Oh, total potato, so it increased growth, sorry, and then it also decreased scab disease by almost 20%. And so this idea of green manures that we've been talking about, I just wanted to throw this in here as an example of there's a whole lot more going on with cover crops and green manures that needs to be studied, because I think if you could be very careful in your choice of green manure or cover crop, it could go a long way toward really producing, in this case, your potato crop to be that much bigger yield and less disease. So you increase your profitability for sure. And so, you probably have heard about the Three Sisters, like the companion planting idea that Native Americans have done for ages, where you would go corn, squash, and beans together. And so this is the idea that the corn grows tall to allow the beans to wrap around and be supported by. The squash is really good because they have big old leaves and they grow close to the ground, so they are keeping the soil moist and keeping weeds out. And then the beans provide good advantage because they are symbiotic with nitrogen fixers. And so the Three Sisters idea, so he was kind of looking at that idea, but turning it into a green manure system instead. And so these companion planting ideas, that's in organic growing on organic farms, I'm seeing more and more of this idea of let's be smart about maybe combining certain crops together. And they're finding that certain crops planted with each other in the same field can actually boost each other's growth, overall biomass yield. And so I think there's a lot more to this that needs to be investigated. So Ben was gung-ho to do it, and the Seeds and Spore farm was very happy to see the results of the decrease in disease. And then this idea is something I wanted to point out that while we're still talking about the soil. Have you heard of this? One Health Initiative? Okay, it's really new. It's only within the last few years, and it hasn't really quite got out into the general public yet. But they call it the One Health Initiative. This is I took this screenshot from a paper that was just published. And basically, they're just saying that when you look at human health, and the other reason I put this with Ben's work is Ben totally is on board with this idea as a doctor. He sees that, when he's treating his patients, he has to think about the whole ecosystem that these people that he works with are in. What are they eating? What are they exposed to? And so human health is not isolated, but connected to the health of animals, plants, and their environment. And so this review was just published, and they did a good job. And I put, if you want to read parts of the paper, I put the link in the notes section. But and then this image is just trying to show how much we are connected ultimately to the soil microbes when you think about it. And especially with the way we currently grow our food, it's soil-based growing for the most part. Okay, so here you're looking at whether you eat animals or the plants or both. You're definitely getting influenced, and so they these authors were really like, okay, ground zero, soil microbes. We really need to think about this and how they are kind of the reservoir of all the microbes that we see. So when you look at, what microbes are in and on you, it's the same as what we see in the soil system, same phylum of phyla of bacteria and same types of fungi. Not everything, obviously, but it's coming from there. So these pie charts are trying to show that, we select for different microbes based on our physiology and actions and our diet. Okay. But I thought it was a nice pictorial representation to try to get that point driven home. So you'll probably hear more about this One Health initiative. We certainly hope that your physicians will start to talk to you about this because it's incredibly important. And I just really like how it's tying back to the soil system of where we grow our crops. And even if you eat a heavy carnivore diet, you're still going to be influenced because they eat crops. Yeah, and so they're interacting with the soil. Okay. So you'll probably hear more about that. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to stop there with soil management. I might circle back to a few of the concepts that were in this, especially with looking at the microbes as we get into some of these other topics. But I wanted to get into the next main topic, which is how do we deal with growing plants and making sure it's the plants that survive all the way to harvest and we don't have the crops decimated. And so this is a new term too. This is just I don't know, within the last year or two, they've started switching. It used to be called integrated pest management. And now they say it's better to call it integrated plant health management to focus on the plants themselves as going for health. So they actually had an International Year of Plant Health back in 2020 through the United Nations. So a big push here to look at how are we doing commercial food production? How do we ensure food security globally? I mean, these are huge problems and scary problems. And even within the United States, we have food insecurity for sure. And so it does link with the lower phrase I have down here. I'm going to link it to the idea of how, having healthy plants and ways to do that will definitely influence the plant's secondary metabolite production, certain chemicals that we really need because they impact our human health. Okay, so I'll be talking more about that as well. So the new acronym is IPHM instead of IPM. And basically integrated. You want to integrate a variety of ideas here. So when you grow plants for commercial production, you want to only grow the plant you want to grow and not have other plants in the mix. So you don't want weeds growing. Certainly don't want insects decimating your crop because they're going to eat it all up. And then you have all the other organisms that can cause disease on the plants to worry about. And so I'll be touching on these ideas. And as you can see, lots of different specialties are needed to really attack this problem. I can't remember if I told you that when I was a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, there's a whole department called weed science. And there's at least 10 different faculty, lots of postdocs and PhD students, all working on weed science. And so it's a big deal. Entomology, of course, the sheer number of insects on this planet. And then you think about all the ones that attack plants, it's mind-boggling. And then add that into plant pathology. I worked in the plant pathology department at the University of Minnesota. which held diverse faculty, lots of different topics they were investigating, all the way from viruses to bacteria and fungi causing diseases. So lots of different fields of expertise, very interdisciplinary. This is kind of a nice snapshot of what are we talking about in terms of how do you do this? Certainly the best way is prevent, right? If you can just prevent this all from happening, that would be awesome, but that is hard to do. And so you often have to be, I had an undergrad student, her summer job in between her junior and senior year, she said, I'm a scout. I said, what do you mean you're a scout? I didn't know where she was working. And then she started explaining that she was working in a field, mainly field-based growing of crops, but some greenhouse too, downstate. One of her big jobs was just walking the fields and scouting for diseases and insects. So, I mean, that was a huge part of her job. She loved it because she had worked in the greenhouse here, so she had gotten familiar with some pests from the greenhouse, and that really expanded her ability to identify, and she was really enjoying it. So identifying and scouting, monitoring, keeping data, and then figuring out what to do if you do find something is a whole another thought process. And then hopefully you are causing disease reduction, and you can continually evaluate how your programs are working. So it's an ongoing process from start to finish. You always have to have this in your head if you're growing crops. One way to attack it is at the very start, work with a plant that has some level of resistance to whatever pest you're worried about. And so it could be resistant to an insect, so that the insect won't be able to attack it and cause significant disease, or it could be viruses, bacteria, fungi. They're finding it's really kind of a good strategy if it's a viral pathogen that you're trying to outsmart, so to speak. And so there are some plants that are resistant through genetic manipulation or breeding. It can be through breeding or through genetic modification. And so breeding is still done. It's tough, but it's done. And then, oh yeah, the classic example for the plant breeding programs that have really led to some success are these rust-resistant wheat. Rust is actually a type of disease caused by a fungus, and it's a massive problem. It goes through population explosions over, certain years are way worse than others. And of course, wheat is our #1 crop globally. So if we have huge outbreaks of this rust fungus, it can be devastating. So that's a big deal when they came out with plant breeding strategies that really helped with that, at least temporarily. Of course, then the fungus figures out a way to overcome that resistance. So it's a continual, you can't just say, okay, we did it, we're good. You always have to keep breeding and keep looking for new strategies because of the coevolution with the, in this case, with the fungus being able to adapt. Genetically engineering, certainly that is a strategy that's done. And so we're talking, going to the lab and using maybe agrobacterium to insert genes of interest. And so those are the GMOs that you've heard about. And classic examples is Roundup Ready resistant crops like cotton, soybean, and corn. And so these have been genetically modified to be resistant to the Roundup. And you've probably heard Roundup is on the list now for being carcinogenic. Not too long ago, was that 2019? I went to a conference where the Monsanto was there, and they were extolling the virtues of Roundup. And I sat in the audience, and I'm like, okay, yeah, how long is it going to be before, it's not so great? And so sure enough, now they're saying it's a carcinogen, it causes cancer. So this was 1997. I went to the conference. It was before that. Yeah. So I was in the audience just going, you're kidding, right? Because no, so it wasn't, it was, yeah. So yeah, all right. BT corn, you probably heard about that. a lot of people don't really know what that's about. The BT stands for, the B stands for bacillus, and the T is thuringiensis. So that's the name of the bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis. So that's a mouthful, so they just shorten it down to BT. But it's a gene from that bacteria that got inserted into the corn plant, and it allows the corn to produce a protein that can be toxic to certain insects. And there was some concern about this with, is it targeting our non-damaging insects? And there was one paper that was published that showed that it could. However, when you actually looked at the experimental design, they exposed that insect to so much of the toxin, like way over what it would ever get. And so it, again, whenever you read published studies, you do have to look at the experimental design, because that one, and then it got published, it got picked up by the general media, and oh, BT corn is evil. And then some scientists said, well, but wait, let's look at the experimental method. And so you have to be really careful about that, because sometimes the general media will grab studies like that and run with it before anyone's really had a serious look at the experimental design. So be careful. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's good science. You really do have to have some ability to read through it. Okay, I keep clicking and it's not advancing. I don't know what's going on. My laptop is possessed. Okay. All right, so genetic resistance, that is kind of like, you know, that's a good question to ask. Are there any crops out there that have been bred or modified? Would that make sense to use? If another method to add in to all this is manipulating your conditions for the crop so that your crop is favored over any pest. So it depends on what your question is, what your crop is, how you're going to do that, but you have to consider tillage strategies or maybe no-till strategies, how you're going to do your water. Some pests thrive under different water levels compared to your crop plant, so you have to be careful. Fertility, you want to, of course, favor the health of your plant and not any of the pests. Also realize that plants have immune systems. I know a lot of people don't understand that, but they do. They have an immune system. And so very similar to us, right? If you eat good and maybe take some supplements now and then and get some good sleep, you're doing preventative health. And that's good for you. It makes you less susceptible. Same idea with plants. You want to create as healthy of an environment for them to boost their immune system. Crop rotation, certainly this can be really successful for certain disease pathogens, because you can really kind of put a wedge in their ability to persist over time. And so you have to realize that, especially in the soil environment, there can be a lot of bacteria and fungi that, you know, pathogens that can overwinter. And so if you don't figure out a way to try to, you know, stop their, either kill them off or decrease their level, you know, just winter's not going to kill them necessarily. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, you know, it's cold, everything dies. No, so just be careful. And then often you will rotate crops. So like if you're trying to grow corn, for example, and the pathogens attacking corn, well, then you would put a different crop into that same field next that the pathogen doesn't bother attacking. And so you kind of break the cycle if you can put in a different crop, as long as you can afford to do that and you have the ability to do that. That's another issue. Sometimes people don't want to put a different crop in that particular field. So, and then just being really careful about all the materials, all the equipment that you're using, that you're not spreading. It's just similar to like our lakes and rivers here, where they say don't, you know, pull your boat out from an infected lake and put it in, drop it into another lake. It's kind of the same idea. Make sure that you're using clean tools. We do that, you know, in the greenhouse as well. We try to make sure that we're sanitizing and cleaning all of our tools. Huh. Okay. Chemicals, of course, there's all kinds of things to think about in terms of all the pests that attack plants. Certainly there are weeds that can get in the way of good crop yield. So herbicides to deal with the weeds, insecticides, miticides, fungicides, nematicides, antibiotics, and on and on. Okay, so this can be costly for sure, all of these options. And we now know that, hey, it might be harmful to the environment. And hey, they might be harmful to the worker, might even cause cancer. So certainly a lot to think about when it comes to picking any of these types of chemicals. And for example, if you're going to be, well, pretty much any of these, you want to try to pick something that is as narrow spectrum as you possibly can for your particular issue. Same idea when you go to the doctor and you're sick with something, they tend to give you a broad spectrum antibiotic if they think you're sick with a bacteria or a fungus. So they tend to just give you a broad spectrum antibiotic, which means especially because they don't have time or the money. They don't want to charge you to figure out exactly what you have. So they do an educated guess. I think you have strep throat. And based on that, I'm going to give you this antibiotic. And often it's broad spectrum to cover their bases. That means it's going to kill a lot of the microbes in you. It's better if you go to the doctor and they figure out exactly what it is you're sick with and they figure out the antibiotic that pathogen is sensitive to, but everything else in your gut or most of the stuff in your body won't be impacted by it. So narrow spectrum, much better, whether it's you or the pathogen or the plant. And so targeted approach is way better than doing it's kind of like the analogy of using a rifle versus using a shotgun, in terms of how wide of a spread of damage it's going to cause or impact. Okay. Another option to consider is biological control or biocontrol. This is something that I've been involved with since my graduate days, graduate research. And so we're looking at the use of beneficial organisms that kill or suppress pathogens. And it can be all kinds of different organisms. I tend to work with bacteria and fungi, but beneficial insects fall into this category. We release beneficial insects in the greenhouse when we have too many pathogens hanging out there. I've purchased thousands of ladybugs that come in these mesh bags. You open the box and they're in these mesh bags crawling around. You take them to the greenhouse and very carefully release them. I found the hard way. I was with my younger son. I think he was maybe, I don't know, 7 at the time. And I'm like, you want to go release some ladybugs? Like, yeah. Well, we start cutting into the mesh bags to release them and they start crawling all over us. They were so active. As soon as we cut into them, they just swarmed up our arms, and then some of them flew and started swarming up my legs. And luckily, he didn't get freaked out. He thought it was funny. Luckily, I kept my cool, and they don't bite or anything, but it's like, ah. So yeah, sometimes you got to be careful about that kind of stuff. All right, we'll stop there and continue on Friday.